Good morning, good afternoon, whatever it is. I am so sorry I was confused on, and I've been doing this for 30 years and had never done this, but I got confused on the expectation today. I've got an abbreviated, I've got an abbreviated PowerPoint, but I understand y'all have a ton of questions, so since we've got an abbreviated time, I don't know if my PowerPoint will address those or not, but we'll go through it very quickly. I would rather get to y'all's questions, quite frankly, because that's, you learn all the points. And I teach a class for Midlands Tech in Columbia on FMLA, and it's 4 hours. So if you ever need a sleeping aid, just come to that class, and it can do it. I was trying to listen to one of my books on the way down to keep me awake, and it's about Teddy Roosevelt and President Taft, and they started, it was 30 minutes on a piece of tariff legislation. I thought, this is not working. So hopefully I won't do that to you today. As we start going through this, stop me if we need to, because the whole point is to get information to you guys. I can't teach you all about FMLA or ADA. They're very intertwined, and as those of you who deal with it know, workers' comp gets thrown in there too, and sometimes you really get to decide which law you're going to violate. I mean, that's kind of the screwy way it works. I will start off by saying FMLA, after USERRA, which is the Military Leave Protection Act, FMLA is probably the most employee-oriented law that I deal with in employment law. Very, very protective of employees, and there are multiple ways that you can violate it, and one of them is called interference. And if you do things like you don't put the information out like the hospital has to do, that can be a violation for interfering with the individual's rights. So it's lots of landmines out there. But let's go ahead and get started. The government actually has done something very good, and on their DOL website, you can go to the wage and hour. This is a wage and hour area. Go to the wage and hour section, and you can find so many fact sheets and questions and answers. They have got great, great stuff when you have questions. And it's really, this is bizarre, but it's written so that it can be understood. And they give good examples. It is a great, great resource. And I always tell people to go here. If you are someone who deals, let me catch my breath, deals with the FMLA a whole lot, get a copy of the regs. You can print them off the website. Get a copy of the regs. In 2009, they redid them. Did everything but intermittent leave, which of course is the biggest mess of all. But again, the regs are actually written to be very understandable. They have good examples sometimes, and that, I mean, that's the law. And it spells it out a lot of times. It's just very clear. And so go in, and if there's an issue that you have to deal with a whole lot, highlight it, mark it up, and keep the copy at your desk. I don't recommend that with a lot of the laws we deal with, because there's so much gray and you can really get in trouble if you tell someone to go out there and do their own research. But this is a good guidance for kind of everyday things. What is FMLA? It's a federal law to begin with. Some states have their own version, and basically you have to go with whichever is most protective of the employee. South Carolina does not, so we don't have to worry about that. I'm really wrong on this slide when I say it guarantees. I work until 2 a.m. about half the time, and this is a mistake in here. It says 12 weeks. That's 12 weeks of ordinary leave. When you get into the military protections for a caregiver for a military situation, or for military exigencies, which are things like rest and recreation when someone covered comes home and you're a family member and everyone qualifies, those things can be up to the caregiver provision can be up to 26 weeks in any year. Now, you don't stack them. So if you've got an employee who has a serious health condition of his or her own, he or she doesn't get 12 weeks and then 26 more weeks in a year. It's up to 26 weeks, but that's a chunk. And this, when it's the caregiver provision, it can be like for a fifth cousin or something, and it doesn't matter if the wife is at home and could better take care of the person. If this is the next person, there's protection. If you get one of these, go to HR. Go to HR on those. If it's an FMLA issue and it's dealing with someone with military, stop there. Don't try to figure it out because that protection is really critical for a number of reasons. Also, one thing that you need to understand, I don't think I have this in the slides anywhere. You guys are all the ears. Is everyone here with the hospital, or are there people from other organizations? Okay, you are the ears of your organization, and depending on how, if you're in management, then anything you do binds and or creates liability for that organization. So if someone says to you, you know, I've got high blood pressure and I keep having to go to the doctor, and then you notice they're having to keep making appointments, that is potentially covered by FMLA. So if you don't know, stop and talk with your HR folks, or stop and find out an answer. I had a call the other day from someone with a bank that I deal with, and this was in HR, and she said, well, we know she's gone back out for surgery and all this, but she just told her supervisor she didn't come to HR. And so it's not covered. And I was like, oh, she's not back, is she? Because we got a problem there. Yes, it's covered. And I can't remember if I have the slide in here. I always get ahead of myself. But it can be the best friend who acts as a spokesperson and comes in and says, Bob is not going to be in this week because he's getting new treatment for some condition, and he wanted me to let you know. Heads up, that you go ahead and send out the FMLA paperwork then. It doesn't matter. There are two things here, and we'll get into it again later. You've got your rules. Everyone's kind of generally got rules on how to report. That's one issue, and that can be a disciplinary issue. But all FMLA requires is for you to have sufficient notice to know that it may be covered by FMLA. Now, if, you know, 5-year-old Jimmy calls and says, Daddy's sick, that doesn't cut it. But if someone acting as a spokesperson calls and gives you sufficient information, it doesn't matter for pure FMLA purposes if that's your proper procedure. Now, you have every right as an employer to hold your employees to your procedures, and there may be a violation for that, and I would always suggest a counseling. I don't suggest terminating someone over that, but you can certainly discipline them over that. And I've probably gone to slide number 32 by now. To whom does it apply? There are minimum requirements, except if you're a public agency. For private employers, it's an employer who employs 50 or more employees for at least 20 work weeks during this year or the previous year. FMLA applies only to certain employees, those we just went through, and they must work for a covered employer. You've got to work 12 months and 1,250 hours. The 12 months can get kind of funky. Say you work for a temp agency and then transition into a new employer. Do the temp hours count? Yes. You put those together. If you've had a break in service, it depends. You have to look at that. So you always want to look at that. This is one thing I found. I get calls sometimes, and someone's very concerned about a new employee who has only been at the company for 3 or 4 months, and she's got to go out on maternity leave or something. Well, it's not covered by FMLA because she hadn't been there the 12 months or the 1,250 hours. Also, this is something, and if you don't look at those things in each instance, I know Liz probably knows with a lot of the employees here pretty quickly whether or not they fit. But if you've got an employee and you really don't know, check it, because again, I've had instances where we were really getting deep into an issue and I say, you know, did this person meet this criteria? And all of a sudden it's like, no. And then the issue's done. You go ahead and give them the initial paperwork and then you decline the FMLA because they don't meet the qualifications. Do you all use the Department of Labor forms? Because those are by far the best ones to use. They've got forms for each of the things you have to notice on. If any of you are doing the notices, there are appendices to the regs, and it is the exact language. It's approved. You know if you use that language, you're not going to get in trouble. So we always recommend that those forms created by the Department of Labor be used. An interesting thing, FMLA is governed by the Department of Labor. And so that's who does the investigations. And it's the Wage and Hour Division, because the FMLA kind of has piggybacked and has some similarities to the Fair Labor Standards Act that deals with all the wage issues. So that's where it's housed. The ADA, which we'll touch on briefly, is housed with the EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. So you've got different bodies who are looking at these things, which can create a different viewpoint.
Yeah, I think we have an outsourced Department of Health source, so they provide that information to us.
They use basically the Department of Labor, and a lot of employers are going to the outsourcing. But one thing important to know about if you outsource, and some of them are great, some of them are really good, but if you outsource, you remain liable. You remain responsible. You don't pass off your liability just because a third party is dealing with it. Now, you may have some kind of agreement where they've got to pay you back some portion if you get hit, but you don't lose your liability there. One thing, if y'all have like a small satellite office or something, and it's within 50 or 75 miles, that may be covered even if it's got a low number of employees. What I see a lot of is those satellite offices or clinics or whatever the case may be covered even if they're 77 miles outside, simply for morale and consistency.
Is it 75 driving miles or 75 miles as the crow flies? Is that a radius, or is that as you drive?
There's always someone like you in the audience. No, I know. It matters, and
because 75 miles for us takes us just about to Columbia. I mean, it's just shy of Columbia versus, or to Columbia as the crow flies. But it's a pretty big deal.
And I normally know I can't tell you. I can't tell you right. If you will give me your. Where's Michelle? I know. And Michelle, can I answer that and send it to you and have you send it to everyone who wants it? Because that is a critical issue, and I'm sorry. Normally I have my regs with me, but I didn't bring them today. But that is right in that provision. But and I want to say it's as the crow flies. Yeah, that bird. But anyway, they're different, and this is one of the things that I was told y'all were interested in. Continuous leave, it's easy. We love it. It's a big old chunk. It gets marked off, and you're done. And you can tell someone how much they've used or how much they have left, and this is like when you've been really good, you get handed one of these. Then there's reduced leave, which you can work with too. If a doctor says, and we're seeing more and more of these, the person, and this is the one that I always see, the person can only work a 40-hour work week. Means no overtime, right? Do y'all get many of those? Computer area is where we really see those. I think those people work nonstop, and in manufacturing. You look at that two different ways. If it is mandatory overtime and they don't work it, if someone stops at the 40 hours because that's what the doctor requires, they don't work mandatory overtime, you count that as FMLA. If it's voluntary overtime, even if they've always worked it for the past 5 years and you've always counted on them, if it's truly voluntary, not FMLA, they just don't have to work it. So that's where that really comes up in reduced leave. Now, a huge difference in FMLA and the ADA. FMLA does not have the reasonable accommodation standard. You know, we all deal with that with the ADA. You don't deal with it with FMLA. The statute doesn't care if it's convenient or not. And there are nurse managers in the operating room who I am convinced if they ever see me out at night, I won't escape alive. Because when they have, well, this really goes more to intermittent leave, because reduced leave, you know mainly when it's coming. It's pretty much a schedule thing. Intermittent leave, you don't know necessarily. You may have unforeseen intermittent leave, and where I've had huge issues with this is a surge tech or a CRNA who calls you know, 5 minutes before they're supposed to be in surgery and says, I can't make it in, it's my FMLA, and that's okay. And under the ADA, there are things we can do. You can transfer, you can do other things. Under FMLA, suck it up. As a kindergarten teacher used to say, tough stuff, cream puff. You know, it's just there. And this, the Congress did not deal with intermittent leave, and it's by far the most difficult part of FMLA.
Even if you got a policy that said you got to call in certain numbers,
They're still protected under FMLA, so you can't touch them for FMLA. If they're not calling in properly, you can address it as a disciplinary issue or a performance issue, but you cannot. You can't take away their FMLA, and almost any time there are FMLA issues, and I'm going to get to both of y'all, anytime there are FMLA issues and you don't know if someone should be covered or whether or not their medical cert's good or that sort of thing, you have two options. One, you can go ahead and provisionally cover them, or if it's an advance notice, you can delay it, but the bottom line is generally you have to cover them while you're figuring it out. Now, you tell them they may not be covered, so they're taking the risk. But yeah, no, this is a huge problem with intermittent leave, or these short call-ins and scheduling. And you talk about, I deal with a steel plant, and they schedule things down. I mean, their margin is so tiny. They have to get everything so properly scheduled. And when someone's on intermittent leave and you get 2 or 3 people and you don't know if they're going to be there or not, and they're in a key position, and that can create issues. You had your hand up first.
Can you do this since it's intermittent, go to the employee and say, due to your intermittent family leave, we won't honor that, but we're going to have to move you into a different position within this, like if you're a nurse, you just may not be an OR nurse, you may be some other type of nurse.
You can if you have a nice fat checkbook. No, you can't. Under the ADA, you can.
The way the DOJ writes it, though, is it doesn't have to be the same job. It has to be a job that's similar with similar advances.
You're talking about he's saying the way the Department of Justice says it doesn't have to be the same job, it has to be a similar job. You're talking about when they come back, and we'll deal with that.
Okay.
Because that's total fiction.
Okay.
But that's also a total fiction.
Okay.
That's not the way it's applied.
Okay.
You bring them back to their job, to their shift, to the place they worked.
That's not what
But that is what all the case law says.
Yeah.
At Burger King, someone was brought back, and they had been, and I'm picking positions out there, they had been a fryer before they left, and they were brought back to counter C, and that was found to be in violation. They had to come back on the same shift, in the same, so substantially similar means the same. I mean, we have people argue in manufacturing that machines run differently. So they want back on their old machine. They don't want to be on this machine that runs more slowly.
Shame on that judgment.
Unfortunately, it's judges across the country. It's not just one. But under the ADA, and that's the deal. That's why you want FMLA to run, because if someone has a disability that you're dealing with, under the ADA, you can transfer them to a position. So if someone is chronically late in the morning, say they take a diuretic, and for a heart condition, I'm making that up too. They don't give medical degrees in law school, but my grandmother did that, so I knew mornings were a tough time for her. So say that's and the person's always late because of that. Okay, under the FMLA, you're screwed until the time runs. Under the ADA, you can transfer that person to the second shift, because then the timing is not going to be a big issue. So the ADA is far more advantageous when you're dealing with these things. FMLA is tough. Yes?
I'm sorry, go ahead. My question is, someone's on intermittent FMLA, and it's like for migraine, and they show up, they're 20 minutes late a couple of mornings, and they say, well, just count that against my FMLA.
Wrong.
So that's not, you can't.
I actually had someone at the Department of Labor laugh at me early when the law went into effect, and because we had someone calling in to a hospital saying, today's an FMLA day. And I said, does that work? And the investigator laughed at me, and I said, look, just try to do it right. And then you look at it, and there's a slide in there somewhere. They have to give enough information for you to know that it is something covered by FMLA. So if the person says, I had to take my medicine 30 minutes ago and I still can't function for my migraines, then you know. Now, Liz, I think what you all do is have them call into FMLA source. So it's done like that, and I assume FMLA source somehow notifies the supervisor, but there's probably still a duty to call the supervisor. But no, just saying, I haven't, this is covered by my FMLA, or I have, you know, because sometimes someone who has a heart condition may be out because they've got a hangover. Hangover is not covered by the med cert for the heart condition. So you are, after you practice this law 30 years, you get a very warped perspective. Oh, well, I mean, people do this stuff. It's just, it's amazing when I'll ask someone, when they're getting ready to fire someone, okay, let's look at this because this person has a med cert and a disability. And then we start looking at why he or she's been out, and it's, well, the car broke down 3 times, the kids have been sick from school, or been in disciplinary issues, and all these other things. Those things, and they don't give med certs for cars, so unless there's a med cert for the child, then those things aren't covered by FMLA, and they can count on the absence, absent part of it.
Given the time, can we go ahead and
Yep.
just go to the questions?
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think y'all have a question on this one too. So, one thing that's very, very important about FMLA, and it comes up with this, and looking at how do you count holidays. If someone's out on FMLA, do you count, you know, the 4th of July if it's on a Wednesday or Christmas on a Wednesday? You count it the same way you do any other unpaid leave. So that's always a trick with FMLA when you're looking at benefits or holidays or anything like that. How do you treat everyone else who's on a similar type leave? And of course, FMLA is that type of leave on steroids. But this is what you do that. Weekends, unless, I would look at that like I would overtime. If weekend work is mandatory, then it would count against FMLA. If it's not mandatory, then it wouldn't count it. One other thing, and to get to your questions, on foreseeable need for leave, you're supposed to be given 30 days notice. You got lots of folks that have regularly scheduled doctor's appointments. If you have certain conditions, you know every 3 months you're going to go to the doctor for your blood pressure or whatever the case may be. In those cases, there should never be an instance when someone comes in the morning they have a doctor's appointment and says, I've got to go to the doctor at 2, I'll need to leave. You ought to have advance notice of those. If it's a foreseeable time to be out, a foreseeable leave, you're supposed to get 30 days. They're also supposed to work with you on that. It's not just, they don't just always get to pick. Now, some things people can't work around. If it's not foreseeable, this is a trick, it's as soon as practicable, which, trust me, the Department of Labor, whenever the employee told you, that was as soon as practicable. So, but the 30 days becomes important. I had a nurse who gave notice for June, and if any of you have ever scheduled nurses' vacations in June, know you don't have a whole lot of room. The supervisor said, we will honor your need for FMLA she needed surgery. And the nurse said, nope, I need it then. I need it right here. And we went back and said, we'll honor it. We're glad for you to take it, but you cannot do it in June. These vacations have all been scheduled. It won't do it. If you want to go in August, that will absolutely work. If there's something different, then your doctor needs to come back and tell us that it has to be at this certain time. She came back again, and the doctor wouldn't say that. The doctor just said, you know, that's when it was scheduled. We went back and forth on this 3 or 4 times. Well, it turns out that she was from the Philippines, and she had planned and already bought her ticket to go home after her surgery and be with her family while she was recuperating and everything. And we held tight and said, if you go in June, you're going to get fired. It's not approved. We will approve it for August. You can have at any point then, and that's consistent with what your doctor's telling us. And fortunately, she blinked. But I think we would have won in that because she had to work with us. The same thing with people who have chronic diseases and you know you're going to have a lot of doctor's appointments, you can try to get them to work with you so that it's not at your busiest time. Try to get them to work with you for, I know people in billing, there are certain parts of the month that are just insane and you don't want them out then. So try to work on those things. But anyway, let me know your questions and we'll just, I'm sorry we're flying so. Oh. Is there a button? Okay, FMLA, gray consistency, yes. Was there, I'm not sure I understand the question.
So Brian stepped out. He just
Consistency is always important with.
well, from the employer side and not the HR part, but it seems like this is also great, but you'll cover it. It's frustrating to us.
It is frustrating. A lot of it is no longer gray. The stuff of who's covered is pretty clear now. There's a lot of case law developed on those things. Where you get into the gray areas, the problem is they really are gray. And sometimes we're on the gamut of risk you want to go. I tend to offer very conservative answers, but when I know that sometimes there's a business decision that causes someone to want to take, a company to want to take a little more risk because it really is a difficult problem. One of the things we look for too, when you've got people who are chronically taking FMLA and each year they utilize every bit of it, and I don't mean to sound insensitive, but there are gaps in there. When they finish their FMLA, you know you're still covered by an ADA issue, but you need to move on it because you've got less restrictions than with FMLA, and if you wait till they regain FMLA and start requesting it again, then you're back under those restrictions. So when you see that little bubble, you know, talk to your team then and go. Limit on concurrent conditions, no, you can have. I had a woman who had med certs for 2 children, her mother and herself, and she worked them. I mean, she knew how to. There are a lot of people who use FMLA who absolutely need it, and they use it honestly and use it as it's intended. Then you got that one person who, if he or she used that skill and creativity with his or her job, it would be amazing. But yes, you can have multiple conditions. Just be sure you keep your med certs current for these things. That med certs are one of your only methods of controlling abuse. Keep them updated. Anyone with a chronic condition, you can get a new one every year. If someone has, I had a case yesterday with someone who was supposed to be at the med cert, said they should be out 2 to 3 times a month, and the woman was constantly out for a week here and a week there. And that's changed conditions. You can ask for a new med cert. And the employee is responsible for getting that. So that's important. Contact employee, yes. If you don't contact them, you'll be heartless. If you do, you'll be heartless because you contacted them while they're out. So that's yes. And if your company policies require that they contact you periodically, that is separate from FMLA, but you can uphold those policies. There's nothing about the FMLA that says you can't use your policies unless it's inconsistent and defeats FMLA. Yes.
Question about contacting employees while they're out on FMLA related to, if I understand it correctly from all these groups, was can they, for instance, can you call them regarding work issues, and if there are meetings that they can be part of are you able to do that?
You can ask them to do it. You can't require them. It's another difference. You can't require them under FMLA to take light duty, even if you've got light duty available, and they could, with the restrictions or the medical situation they have, they could do it. You can't require it under the FMLA.
Those enrollments count towards non-FMLA.
No, yeah.
If they get so
That's what gets complicated in counting this, because if they're working, there are a few cardinal rules, and one with FMLA, you can never count more time toward FMLA than the employee requires. And you can count as small as an hour or even go to the smallest, I mean, most people do time in 7 minutes or 15 minutes, and you can go that small. I think you're a glutton for punishment if you do. And if you don't have a third-party provider that calculates all your timing and all that stuff for you, which is probably worth the money alone, there are a lot of tools out there that you can get that go to that. Did I answer the question? Okay. If I don't hit what y'all are asking, ask me again. The employer's responsibilities, there are a number of notices that you have to give. One is saying you have a condition that may or may not be covered, here's what we need from you. And the key thing in that notice, and if you use the Department of Labor notice, it's covered. The key thing, because this has to be in writing, is if you do not get the med cert to us within X amount of time, your time will not be covered by FMLA. If they are not told that in writing, it's a freebie. You absolutely want to be certain that that is in writing. And I've got one right now with a woman who hadn't gotten her med cert in and all this, and she just called in and said, you know, it's workers' comp. And so she's going to get a little letter that says, that's nice. This is FMLA we're looking at. You've got to do your med cert or it will not be counted as FMLA. Because this woman also, I mean, she's got more things going, but she, of course, was on her last absence before termination under the attendance policy. So if we don't have that in the letter, then there's a letter saying you are or not approved, you have this many days left. That's an employer's responsibility. You've got to tell someone when they can come back. There are all these things. You have to tell someone in writing before they go out or when you first accept FMLA if you're going to require a fitness for duty release when they come back. If you don't do it when they first go out, you can't do it. You've got to do second and third opinions when you're first getting a med cert. You can't do it if it goes on for a longer period of time and that sort of thing. Or when you get, for instance, with a chronic condition, if you get a new certification for a chronic condition, then you can get a second or third opinion. Those are very rare. You want them when you have a reason to believe that the person's not being honest. We had one, and this is where Facebook is. Facebook, you know, some woman didn't get her vacation leave, so she posted on Facebook, and this was a nurse, she posted on Facebook that she had already paid for a condo in the Virgin Islands, so she had a med cert, so she was going to use FMLA, and she had a meeting the next day with her supervisor, who she forgot she had friended. So anyway.
But Kathy, and the reality is though, we would have a hard time, many of us would have a hard time disciplining that person because of fear of the FMLA rules. So what's the verbiage we use to keep Liz safe when
Well, I tell you what we did in that case. We knew the length of the plane ride to the Virgin Islands, and we knew the woman's condition was a bad back. We went to her doctor and said, would you have approved this if she had come to you with it? And he said, absolutely not. Now, because her manager had screwed up in the way she had communicated things, what we did is re-educate both of them and counsel the nurse who was not truthful. So it's very, very fact specific. I know that doesn't help and it sounds like I'm wiggling out. I'm really not. It's very fact specific with what someone's done. An employee's responsibility, and this is important, it's up to them to get the med cert into you. That's their responsibility. Doesn't matter if the doctor doesn't do it. That's what we hear all the time. I gave it to my doctor won't do it. Generally then say, would you like me to fax one to them, or you want me to send one directly to them? Because you you don't want to just act quickly when they don't get it in, but that is their responsibility. And that's one thing a lot of employees don't necessarily like.
We have a lot of times here, employees on intermittent or on FMLA, and they're supposed to be calling in their hours. And that's what I have a lot of trouble. Sometimes the managers come in my office because the thing is they're supposed to be doing it, but then when we call FMLA source up, that's our third-party provider.
They say that's not an
They
FMLA
don't-
issue?
They don't have the hours in, so that's why we
Oh,
have
okay.
to take the initiative at times. Because the thing is, we want to make sure we're tracking your hours. So if they're not doing it, then
You're talking about their FMLA hours, not their, I thought there are two different things there. If someone was supposed to be calling in about work hours, that's performance, and you can directly address that. If they're supposed to, and this is one thing with the third-party provider. And this is one reason your supervisors and managers are so key. Your frontline people see things and know what's going on. And, you know, it's real easy just to shoot an email to whomever it is that that's the keeper of FMLA and say, are you aware that Michelle is out today or has been out for the last 3 days or whatever, so you can keep up with time. It never hurts to double do that, yes.
What if the med cert is very generic, and I'll be allowed to ask a specific?
There are 2 times you can go back to the physician. That's a great question. When you have clarification or authentication. Authentication is to call the doctor and say, or doctor's office and say, did y'all issue this and is the content correct? Okay, you're allowed to do that. You have to give the employees 7 days to correct any deficiencies before you make that contact. The other thing, let's see, that was authentication. Clarification is if you get a med cert and it doesn't tell you squat, then you're allowed to call and clarify it and find out what the time limits are, all of that information that you need. You cannot ask for medical records. You can't ask for anything beyond that, but you can do those things. The direct supervisor may never be the one to contact the healthcare provider. That's another absolute. Okay, we talked about number 6 already, and it is you bring them back to their position, or you risk it being actually being a interference claim.
What if their position goes away?
If their position would have gone away or they would have been laid off, regardless of the FMLA, it can still go away and they can still be laid off, even with FMLA. One thing that becomes a problem is if while someone's out on FMLA, all of a sudden there's evidence or you see performance issues you might not have been aware of because they were there and could cover them up. Timing of when to deal with that is very difficult because you don't really want to call someone at home after back surgery and say, you're going to be on a final write-up, because then that comes across as cruel and inhumane. What you do is you go ahead and document everything with the date as you're doing it and document the fact that you're waiting to deal with it until they can come back. If someone goes out on maternity leave and takes FMLA for that, and they indicate that they really aren't going to come back, they just want to use FMLA so they can stay on benefits, you can end it then. Most people wouldn't, but you can. If someone clearly indicates that they aren't coming back. Now, if they haven't formally given a resignation, they will come back and say they were just thinking about it, they hadn't made up their mind, and you're violating their rights. So,
Kathy, if you guys found somebody that did have documentation that was correct, errors in your job performance, and they come back, April 5th, and so on April 6th, we have a disciplinary action, would that be perceived as retaliation?
everything's perceived as retaliation. I mean, there are some things you can't get around. But that's why I'm saying when you learned it, when you found it, document that date and what it is and why you're waiting. So document contemporaneously why this date was created. That you're purposely not calling them while they're out. But it's enough of a performance problem, it's got to be dealt with. If you have, they're coming back April 5th, and on March 14th you've got this all documented, I mean, it still could be argued to be retaliation because they're out. But just be clear on what you're doing. I don't think you give up on those performance issues and just suck them up because the timing's bad. If someone truly has a performance issue bad enough to document or to address, then hopefully you've got your paper trail and you've got your specifics. If it's something just amorphous and you can't really, when you're asked to articulate it, you can't give it the times and instances where there were the performance issues, this is not the time to begin. And some managers get irritated and they want to. And that's not the time to begin. Retro FMLA, real quick, I'll do this. You can do it if you find out if someone's been taking leave once a month for the past 6 months for a couple of days and you don't know that it maybe should be covered by FMLA until they're about to get written up and they say, well, wait a minute, that's all because I've been going to the doctor. And that's, say, 15 days that should have been FMLA. You can go back and cover it unless it would cause them harm. The example given of that is if someone took FMLA, say, to take care of their child who would be covered. And you didn't tell them and you wanted to go back and count it, but they were scheduled for surgery coming up, and so because they had taken the FMLA that you didn't tell them was FMLA, they weren't going to have enough time for their own surgery, then you can't retroact. But those are very rare.
Let me give you a specific example. We've got a nurse that's not in this institution who was out and had FMLA for kidney stones, intermittent. Well, she now started calling in for back pain and was going to have to be out. She said, well, I'm going to go see the doctor and I'm sure he's going to retro. This is in December. She does get the appointment in January for her back pain with the neurosurgeon, and now they're going to retro her FMLA for those previous days. Is that legit?
Yeah, I mean, but usually it's the employer that's doing it. But you could.
I don't want to. I mean, the reality is, many of these people we want rid of, the ones that are gaming the system, and everybody's had to deal with those. But here's something I don't want employed.
Mm-hmm.
I would like to terminate, but they're gaming the system. Do I have to honor that retro FMLA?
If it is FMLA,
Well,
and you've just no, I understand your question. If it qualifies as a serious health condition, I don't know how that doctor could make it retroactive if he or she wasn't treating her at that time.
had no relationship with the patient until that date.
But the doctor's willing to say this is the case and it has been the case for the past 6 months or whatever. That depends on where on the risk factor you want to go. But typically it's the employer going back and covering. If you've got someone who's using it, get them to use it all. The gamers, get them to use it all as fast as they can, because in the gaps they're going to mess up sometime. They're going to mess up. But anyway, you've got the information on the size of the organization. It's 50. I mean, I've got clients who will not 50 in the 20 weeks proceeding. I've got clients who will not hire over 49 people, and they deliberately watch it because they don't want to have to. They're small enough they don't want to have to deal with it, and that's one of the first things when I have a new client. We'll go into that.
Captain, does contract labor count in your 50th employee count? So
Yes.
We contract with a
Yes.
security company, say, and that there's 4 security guards. We only have 46, but there's 4 security guards.
They're joint employees.
Okay.
You can get hit for a lot of people that are contracted. I'm not sure I know what 12 is. Repeated FMLA accrue, take eligibility.
I can.
Okay.
An employee that works for 10 years, and they have a chronic health condition, so fibromyalgia, and they continue every time they accrue a day, they take it. And they do that ongoing. They do that forever and ever.
Mm-hmm. Isn't that lovely? Yes, no, they can. It depends on, and this is the reason most people don't use a calendar year. They use the rolling year that works off of when FMLA is taken and all that. But because if you use a calendar year, someone can do 12 weeks, the last 12 weeks of the year and the first 12 weeks of the next year and be out for a nice long time. Now, again, someone has back surgery, that may be a wonderful thing for them. If someone, I'm not going to go into my, anyway, you can see where that would be some issues. Paid accrued leave, FMLA, FMLA is not paid, but you can require someone to use their paid vacation or PTO, whatever you call it, for FMLA. They get really mad about that. But you can require that those be used up, so someone can't have 12 weeks of FMLA and then come back, and if they're entitled to 3 weeks of vacation, take that on top. We actually in our firm had someone do that because you can stack, and the whole staff was so mad at that person. They really felt sorry for her when she'd been out because her child was sick, but kind of drug out, and then all of a sudden she was going to, to the beach or something like that, and everyone's saying, I've been doing double work for all this time. So that's one reason a lot of places will run paid leave concurrently with FMLA. Does anyone else have any questions or have I missed any that we didn't touch on?
7 to 8, 9. I don't think we do 7 to 8.
Who can take leave? Part of that's going to be in the handout. It is, you can take it for your, who said that? You can take it for your own serious health condition. You can take it for a minor child's your minor child's health condition. You can take it for your spouses. You can take it for your parents, not for your in-laws. And we get lots of folks wanting it for in-laws. You can take it for an adult child in specific situations. I had a case, the adult child has to not be able to care for themselves. I had a case with, and this was in a hospital, a grandmother who was wanting to take it to go to Chicago to take care of her adult child who had a high-risk pregnancy and a 2-year-old and couldn't take care of herself. Now, the grandmother couldn't get it to go take care of the 2-year-old. That wouldn't qualify, okay? The babysitting thing doesn't qualify. But she could get it because the adult daughter who had the high-risk pregnancy could not care for herself. Now, the tragedy there was the adult daughter lost the baby, and it was very tragic. But when that happened, the cause for the med-cert, and the med-cert would come from the adult daughter's doctor, is where that would come from. When she lost the baby, that ended the basis. I mean, she was going to be able to take care of herself relatively quickly, but there was a huge emotional impact. And what we did is, it wasn't FMLA anymore, but the facility had other types of leave that they could allow the grandmother to take for a week or two to help her daughter work through some things. So you have to look at all the options you have. We've touched on ADA a lot. One thing that I'll tell you there that I think is very important, a lot of times I'll get the question at the end of the 12 weeks, can I replace this person? Because I need someone in this job, it's important. And lots of times with FMLA issues, you got ADA considerations running right along with it. And an accommodation under ADA is leave. Sometimes, not always, but leave is one form of accommodation. I actually talked to an EEOC commissioner who said that unlimited leave is a reasonable accommodation. And I said, in what world do you live? I mean, it's just, that doesn't make any sense to me. The courts really have not found that. If you know someone has been out a year or something and there's no projected date when they're going to be able to return, at that point we start looking at termination. But and there are things that say, even with the ADA, bringing someone back to their same job is a reasonable accommodation, because if you don't, you're not really accommodating them. I disagree with that. You try to be sure to bring them back to a job, but again, the big thing with the ADA is you can transfer people. If they've got restrictions that are too tight and you can't function with it, then at that point, unlike FMLA, you are discussing reasonable accommodation. So, and that's in the employee's best interest, and you don't have to do exactly what they come in and say, this is what has to be done. No, you have to have what's called an interactive discussion and look at the possibilities and look at what can be done. So I'll tell you one other case that don't accommodate things unless you know there's a medical condition that requires accommodation. Don't do it just to be a good supervisor or something. That's not being a good supervisor. I had a case with, I don't know what, maybe they were all phlebotomists or lab or something. They had to run all over the hospital. And what was happening is the people who had been doing it a good while didn't want all the remote locations. And one had had knee surgery 6 years ago and said she still couldn't do it. We had no medical evidence of that at all. And someone else, there were a number of things. It kind of worked out. The more senior people were taking the choice locations, and the newer people were getting stuck with the other, and they were getting tired of it and didn't like it. So we had some unrest. So I said, well, wait a minute, are these accommodations supported? And they weren't. The supervisor had just been doing it. And the problem also becomes, and I'll stop, that once you've done something without going through the formal process, you can't argue that you can't do it as an accommodation. If you've been working people in limited areas, then obviously you can do that. So the only reason we could stop that in this instance was because these individuals really didn't have disabilities. And so be sure that you have something that requires a reasonable accommodation.
Finish this up. One last question about
Sure.
because this has come up, and I'll give you a generally accurate scenario. So we have a nurse in an office who has FMLA for something, she doesn't call in timely, and it puts the office in a very bad situation, because much like manufacturing, we're talking about, we run at fairly minimal staffing, we only have what we need. So it puts the office in a terrible position. She's got intermittent FMLA. She's not calling in a timely fashion. So we've got performance issues. How do you decide when you can terminate this independent of the FMLA and based purely on performance and keep ourselves safe?
You're never going to be totally safe. Okay,
That's fair.
so I can't ever give you that. I would do it so that you can show that it is beyond, if you've got a comparable person that you've terminated for comparable type performance issues who's not protected by FMLA, and purely the fact that she's not following procedure and that sort of thing, not the fact that she's out. If you've got a comparable person and you can show someone who was terminated in a similar situation, that's a strong position. Anything beyond that, you start kind of going down the gamut of risk. And you find out, FMLA is one of these. You hang it on the cross and hope you don't, you know, it's like I said, other than USERRA, it is the most protectionist statute there is for employees. And it's tricky. There are some places, make them do the med certs, make them call in, you know, make them do all of those things, make them do what they're obligated to do, but it is very, very employee-centered. I hope again, I apologize, and I hope I got some of those questions that y'all wanted. My email's on there. If you have a follow-up question or something, I'll do my best to answer it, and I will follow up with the question about the 75 miles.
We'll get that out. That was for the other, that's not for the hospital, that was for the other businesses.
Okay,
We hear the
yeah.
locations from them.
Thank you all for coming.